Hello, I'm Richard Frey. My pronouns are he and him. Frances Ellen Watkins Harper. What's in a name? Frances Ellen was her birth name, given when she was born free, September 24th, 1825, in Baltimore. Her parents died, leaving her an orphan when she was only 3. Watkins, her third name, was the name of her uncle, the Reverend William Watkins, a free African-American man who raised her in Baltimore. Watkins was the minister of a great AME, African Methodist Episcopal Church. A passionate activist for the end of slavery, he brought up Frances to be a polite and well-educated young woman, and of course, a member of her uncle's congregation. When she was 14, as was typical in those days, as was typical in those days, she began a working life. She moved in with a Quaker family, working for them as a house servant. Their house was full of books, and her employers encouraged Frances to read as many as she liked. Having educated herself well, she found a teaching position in Ohio at the AME Union Theological Seminary, later Wilberforce University. Her reputations as an educator and speaker grew. For her marriage in 1860 to her farmer named Fenton Harper, that's her last name, lasted only 4 years until his death. To support herself and her 4 children, Frances resumed her career as a speaker. Despite friend William Still's warning that travel in the South would be dangerous for a woman, she spoke in all the states but Kansas and Texas, sometimes giving as many as 4 talks a day. She moved to Philadelphia and lived with the great manager of the Underground Railroad, William Still, and his wife, Letitia, for 2 years. Then moved to her house at 1006 Nordane Street. There you may find a historical marker of her life there, placed by the state of Pennsylvania. When she was only 20, in 1845, Harper wrote her first volume of poetry, Forest Leaves. It was the first widely circulated book by an African-American published in America. This was the beginning of her great and varied life as a poet, writer, novelist, public speaker, teacher, and an activist for abolition of slavery, temperance, women's suffrage, and most of all, continuing throughout her life, a powerful advocate for equal rights for African Americans. Frances's long and fruitful path eventually led to many years of attending the First Unitarian Church. She died at 85 in 1911, 9 years before women gained the right to vote. Harper's funeral services at First Unitarian were conducted by Kenneth E. Evans, minister of the smaller Spring Garden Unitarian Society. Perhaps because she preferred his racial advocacy to that of Charles St. John, by then the minister of our First Unitarian. A tribute published in the African-American newspaper, New York Age, quoted a church member eulogizing her as authoress and lecturer, and one of the church's oldest and most faithful members. Her first and enduring connection with First Unitarian came when she visited our second church building at 10th and Locust Streets. There she heard the fiery abolitionist sermons of the Reverend William Henry Furness. In 1825, the year of Francis Harper's birth, the Reverend Dr. Furness was called from Boston to serve us Unitarians at the ripe old age of 22. He had been moved to begin speaking on abolition by the burning by an anti-Black mob of Pennsylvania Hall, which had just been built as an auditorium for abolitionist speakers. From that point on in his long pastorate, he became one of the greatest advocates in Philadelphia, indeed in America, for an end to slavery. After years of visiting and hearing the passionate and erudite sermons at First Unitarian, Harper was still a frequent attender at the large and rich Mother Bethel A Church at 6th and Lombard Streets, where it still stands today. Francis Harper became a payer of pew rent at First Unitarian. This was the custom of many Protestant churches well into the 20th century. It's often read by historians as a sign of membership. At one point, when Furness had passed his 50-year pastorate on to the Reverend Joseph May, Francis Harper's pew rent was paid by May when she could not afford it. We know in today's First Unitarian Church that Harper sat for many years in the third row of pews on the left. You may have seen the banner honoring her placed by former church member Anthony Hodnett near where she sat as a young woman. During the time Francis Harper continued to attend our church, she became one of the greatest writers and activists of the 19th century. She worked with Black and white, young and old, in diverse causes. Of course, abolition, but also women's suffrage, temperance, education, and always better lives for African Americans, whether they were slave or free, Northern or Southern, rich or poor. The nature of her close work with many of the most important white reformists of her time may be glimpsed in a speech she gave in May 1866 at the 11th National Women's Rights Convention in New York. She was on a platform together with leading white suffragists, Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Lucretia Mott. Her address was called, "We Are All Bound Up Together," as she said, in one great bundle of humanity. In her talk, she proclaimed, "You white women speak here of rights. I speak of wrongs. I tell you that if there was any class of people who needed to be lifted out of their airy nothings and selfishness, it is the white women of America." Harper had heard and been moved by the sermons and action of William Henry Furness. In 1876, the new minister, the Reverend Joseph May, became her pastor. The son of an equally fiery abolitionist minister friend of Furness, Joseph May of Syracuse, the younger May carried on abolition preaching at the church and gave many varied sermons, deeply influential to Francis Harper. Having already written 3 novels, serialized in newspapers, and with hugely broad sales of many poetic works, one, Poems on Miscellaneous Subjects, sold about 12,000 copies and was reprinted at least 20 times in her lifetime. Harper wrote her most well-known work, a novel called Iola Leroy, or Shadows Uplifted. It was published in 1893 with 3 printings. It's often seen as the most important African-American novel of the 19th century. It's the story of a woman born into slavery, Iola Leroy, and her many travels, her relatives, friends, and enemies. Written in ordinary English, it has many of her slave heroes speak in the patois they developed, used as a way to talk with each other without letting their masters know what they were communicating about. Page 1 of Iola Leroy starts, "Good morning, Bob. How's butter this morning?" "Fresh, just as fresh as can be." "Oh, glory," said her questioner, whom we shall call Thomas Anderson, although he was known by his acquaintances as Master Anderson's Tom. On the conversation goes, and we learn that Bob and Tom are giving the names that the Union Army is giving the news that the Union Army is doing well. The butter is fresh. We learn details of the harsh lives these friends will endure. We follow them all through the novel and read of the horror they experience, along with dozens of Black and white slave and free people all over the North and South. Iola Leroy is so light-skinned that she could pass for white, but she always refers to herself and presents herself as Black. Early on, before the happy conclusion of Iola Leroy is the conclusion of Iola Leroy, Iola is enslaved, goes through horrific abuse, but is always nurturing to many damaged people of all shades of skin color and personality. Ultimately, after a very short chapter, she and some of the other characters are reunited with relatives long ago torn from their slave families. And Iola marries Dr. Latimer, also light-skinned, but acknowledging his Black heritage. Before the happy ending of the story, one man, long enslaved, when told the vile news that his wife has been sold, roars as, quote, "a spasm of anger darkened his face and distorted his features, as if the blood of some strong race were stirring with sudden vigor through his veins." Sitting in her pew in our church, Frances Harper was awash with the multifaceted, learned, and literary sermons of the Reverend Joseph May. She soaked up many ideas which found their way into her novel. Unitarian-inspired ideals such as hope and justice. She heard May preach anti-creedal, individual principles, character, as opposed to the salvation preached at more traditional Christian churches, like her own African Methodist Episcopal Church. May spoke of self-developed character. It was the basis for her freedom of beliefs it was the basis for freedom of beliefs as expressed by participants in Iola Leroy, guided by their own principles rather than by the orthodoxy of salvation. Don Coleman, a writer of a new and comprehensive essay describing many sermons by May and the way they gave form and shape to Iola Leroy, says that May's high regard for literature may have helped keep Francis Harper coming to First Unitarian long after its abolitionist standard bearer, Furness, had retired. Even after his 50 years as a pastor, William Henry Furness continued as an active emeritus minister until his death in 1898. The freedom songs of 1963 Mississippi have their counterpart in the secret slave meetings in the forests that Harper described so beautifully in Iola Leroy. But even the greatest movements for racial reform in all centuries had a way in history of always falling backwards after periods of constructive development. Coleman analyzes Harper and Iola Leroy in a new way of interpreting African-American writing of the 19th century, such as Iola Leroy. Continually evolving with new and more nuanced study, this movement began about 20 years ago. Compared to its predecessors, the new writing on historic literature is bringing us a new and more respectful take on Harper's revealing writings. In these days, so filled with violence and division, and also filled with hope for a future where Black lives do matter, we can look back and see what Francis Harper's knowing preacher in Iola Leroy, Reverend Carmichael, saw. For the evils of society, there are no solvents as potent as love and justice. And our greatest need is not wealth and learning, but a religion replete with life and glowing with love. May we bring such deep and loving insights into our own times. Amen.
Hi, I'm Reverend Hannah Capaldi.
And I'm Reverend Abby Tennis. We are the ministers at the First Unitarian Church of Philadelphia, where our mission is to awaken love and justice in our lives and in the world.
We're so grateful that you watched, and we hope that the sermon connected with your soul.
We also want to invite you to join us for a live worship service every Sunday at 11 a.m. Eastern Time. You can always find the link to that service on our website at www.philauu.org. In these services, you'll hear words like you've just heard, and you also get a chance to greet one another, pray together, sing together, and we even hold a virtual coffee hour after services to get a chance to greet some new and old friends.
If you want to support the mission of this community and you feel moved to give, you can do so by going to the website that Reverend Abby just mentioned. You can find that link below, or you can text 215-709-5095 and follow the prompts to give.
If someone in your life needs to hear these words today, we encourage you to share this video. And again, thank you so much for watching.
We hope to see you soon.